Yep, and it's red.
And the time is elapsing, so that means it's recording, right?
Yes.
Okay. I thought I did that last time, and it wound up there was no video there. So, okay, good. So we're going to begin with this ontological argument. That one moment in the film where all of the propositions and premises are laid out is on your sheet here. Does everyone at least feel like they have a handle on how the argument at least is trying to work? Okay? Yeah. So we're not going to read over that again, but I wanted you to have it so you can look at it. And I emphasized every term and phrase exactly as the author did in the film. So that's why maximally great being is in red. Some words are bold-faced and some are bold-faced and italicized. So just letting you know, because those all have important emphases on them. Here's my first question. Now that you've been exposed, and you probably have seen this argument before, and if you haven't, then you're seeing it for the first time. It doesn't matter. This is a good question for everyone. Do you see how this argument approaches the problem of the existence of God, or the question? Do you see the method it's using? In fact, how would you describe this approach or method? So we're going to be a little interactive tonight. I don't want to talk the whole time. And so how would you describe this approach, this method?
Well, one thing I do like about it is it defines what God really is. It's a maximally great being.
Right.
Power, knowing, and what was the third one? Moral, yeah.
Yeah, morally perfect, yeah. Now, and that kind of speaks to one of the distinctions I want to make tonight, though. The argument itself, especially when you look at just the formulation of it in Anselm's original work, the proslogion. It's actually on the sheet, by the way. The monologion and the proslogion are where Anselm are. Those are the two works where he talks about this argument. But he doesn't actually mention those traits. He simply defines God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So if you may want to take that as a note. I don't want to overwork you tonight. I know we're here to have fun, but that's his literal wording. Anselm defines God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. But Mark, you hit on something important here with your remark, and that is Anselm starts with a definition of God. That's what's key. In other words, he starts with a concept, with an idea, if you will, right? Right? And actually, by the way, concept in philosophy refers just to terms. And hopefully this doesn't sound too impious, but God is the concept here that we're addressing, right? An idea, on the other hand, is a claim made or predicated upon a concept. Does that make sense? So just so you get a little handle on how philosophy works here. Concepts are single words generally, or very short phrases, whereas ideas are full sentences. Does that make sense? So God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived is an idea. Okay? So if I use that kind of terminology, you'll know what I'm doing. So that's part of the and this is why then that Anselm's approach is often referred to as an a priori approach, meaning prior to in Latin. In other words, prior to what? Prior to human experience. Anselm is not working off of any kind of human experience in trying to talk about God and proving God's existence. He's starting with an idea. Okay? He's starting with an abstraction. He's starting with a definition and then works from there. That's the nature of this method or approach here, okay? And I've got a couple more terms then in that worksheet here. Apophatic and cataphatic. These are important terms in theology. Have you ever worked with these? Okay. Apophasis and cataphasis, excuse me, are Greek terms that were coined in the 19th century, okay, in theological scholarship. The apophatic approach to God, this is not great. What I had. Oh, it's there. There it is. Okay. The apophatic approach is known as the negative approach to God. It gets at God by saying what God is not. Okay? It gets at God by noting the severe limits on human knowing and how we're likely in error in even our approaches or approximations to God. We don't have time to go into some of the history of this, but there were even some early church fathers, theologians like Pseudo-Dionysius, who seemed to approach God this way. Pseudo-Dionysius wrote a famous book called The Cloud of Unknowing. And so God is so incomprehensible, it's hard to really capture him in the human mind. Does that make sense? That's the apophatic way. The cataphatic way is, on the other hand, because we can't just use pure apophatic approaches to God. We need to say some positive, more specific things about God, like you even did a moment ago, Mark, right?
Yeah.
Because if we don't, number one, we've got a very basic problem now. If all we do is go around saying God is incomprehensible, God is incomprehensible, well, how are you going to prove God even exists then? How do you know he even exists if he's so incomprehensible and transcendently distant from us, right? Does that make sense? So we need to be able to positively say certain things about God. Now, some of those characteristics about God are provided by revelation. Christians generally believe, right? Through Scripture, through the Bible, right? Things that we wouldn't arrive at by mere human reason. But for most of Christian thought traditions, even reason can say some things specifically about God. That's what we're going to get into tonight. But that's the cataphatic way, okay? The positive way. And that gives us the other advantage too of suddenly making us feel connected to God, right? And that's kind of that's the whole point of religion, let's face it, right? Is to understand that God-human connection, right? Otherwise, really, if God is so transcendent and incomprehensible, then we don't seem to have any relationship to him, right? Even if he does exist. Um, so we can we only talk about God apophatically without some affirmations of God's nature cataphatically? The answer seems to be no. And so generally, when we are talking about certain infinite, i.e. infinite qualities of God, we are working apophatically. Because the in means not, right? That's what that prefix means. Not finite, not this, not that, right? So we're negating something from the material world or the human world, right? Or putting limits on it and saying God is much more beyond that, right? That's the apophatic way. So whenever you see infinity language with reference to God, you're dealing with apophasis, okay? On the other hand, when you're dealing with the omni qualities, you're dealing with cataphasis, the cataphatic way. You're saying positive things about God. He's all this, he's all that, right? Sometimes you'll even see, and actually I prefer this, I'll be honest. I prefer perfection talk. God is perfectly knowing. God is perfectly powerful. God is perfectly good. God is perfectly loving. Okay? I think that's actually better than simply all. And so, does this argument, at least, given this initial discussion now, does it seem to have at least some validity to your minds? Do you think? there's a parlor trick here of some kind. A lot of and I like the fact that the video starts with some famous philosophers calling it a charming joke. Schopenhauer famously said that. Others thought, yeah, there's some kind of shell game trick going on here, right? And so a lot of people just kind of dismiss it, but I don't. I got to be honest. One of the philosophers, he's still very much alive today. He's in retirement now, I believe. He's emeritus at Notre Dame. Alvin Plantinga. I've met him twice and talked with him about this. He's a great man. One of the most gentle Christian souls I've ever seen. And yet, when you get him in a debate, I mean, he's very nice, but he is about as tenacious. You cannot take this guy down very easily at all. He's very, very sharp. And he thinks the ontological argument works. He not only thinks it's valid, but it's sound. Do you guys know from logic the distinction between validity and soundness?
Is it like validity is basically something that's factually true, I think?
Yeah.
Whereas sound is like it feels more like something that's kind of has like a solid basis or evidence to support it, but it's like not exactly the same thing as being like definitively flat.
Yeah, you're on the right track, Art. Definitely. That's probably the most famous textbook syllogism, right? You've probably even maybe seen this in a textbook. If I wrote down all men are mortal, and then Socrates, I abbreviated, is a man, I have to conclude the bottom line statement, right? This argument is therefore not only valid, but it's sound, because not only does the form of the argument work, but all the premises are true as well. Does that make sense? These are the two premises, and this is the conclusion, right? But what if I did this? All spiders are blue. And feel free to laugh. You're kind of supposed to. All spiders are blue. Joe is a spider. Therefore, Joe is blue. Is that a very good argument? Obviously not. But do you notice something? Does this conclude necessarily from this? Yes, it does. The form of the argument works, but the content, right? The premises themselves, particularly this, not true, right? This is a valid yet unsound argument. Does that make sense? Valid yet unsound. Valid and sound, valid and unsound. Okay? And so again, and it's a form-content distinction, right? Validity deals only with the form of the argument. And it can be an utterly nonsense argument like this one, right? But soundness goes further and says the content of the premises are true as well. Yeah, Joe.
Was Jesus a man?
Huh?
Was Jesus a man?
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, I understand where you're going with that. Yeah, that's the one guy who makes this kind of a problem. I get that. Yeah, let's not go down that route.
No, I got you. I have a more.
But that's an interesting.
Question. Yeah, sure. So
that's a fun. There's something fun there to deal with, and in a certain sense, though, he did die, right?
Yeah, I suppose.
If it's fake, it's not like it was a fake death, right?
Yeah, sure.
He really did die.
A more reasonable question.
Yeah.
Regarding the possible worlds issue,
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'm not fully convinced because I wonder, is there a possible world in which there are no possible worlds? In other words, could I conceive of a world in which there were no worlds to begin with?
Yeah, you're speaking to another. So this is actually be a separate chapter in the book I want to write.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would get some. Yeah, so there are smart people in the room. I thought this tonight might be easy, but no softballs. No, that's actually an excellent, because here's the problem. Here's the problem. Then your good question, your excellent question's getting at it already. And that is referring to God to world talk or universe talk makes God out to be, and I really want to use this language. I'm very good about citing my sources, by the way. I never want to take credit for something that's not mine. I am a big, big, big fan of this Catholic thinker. His name is, I was watching him before tonight's show. I'm going to call this a show. You should watch this guy. He's absolutely brilliant. He's Bishop of Minnesota. He's brilliant and very personable. He says this: we cannot conceive of God, and this is a big problem with the way atheists talk today, because it seems to me they tend to see God this way. God is not a mere item within the universe. He's not a being within the universe. He is the ground, the necessary ground of all being. That's why when Moses, in the famous chapter in the book of Exodus, right, he's at this burning bush, he's engaging with this holy being, he's not sure who he's talking to, right? And what big question does he ask God at that point? At a certain point, he says, "What is your name?" And if you read the text carefully, you can tell Moses is feeling so lost, in a sense, that he's looking for something specific, like the cultures around him. Remember, he comes out of Egyptian culture. He was an Egyptian prince at one point. And did they have many gods? Absolutely. Not only that, back then, if you look at, I've actually taught mythology before, and I'm a big fan and student of mythology. Very instructive stuff. Tolkien, all those guys, C.S. Lewis, they all believed in mythology. Myth does not equal lie. That's a separate talk, though. But my point in saying this is the gods in mythologies all had specific domains, even, that they lorded over, right? We know this from Greek mythology, right? There was the god of the underworld. There was the god of storm, the god of war, the goddess of the hunt, right? The goddess of the harvest, etc. See what I'm getting at? And Moses is thinking that way. Who are you? What is God's famous reply? I am. Very important moment in the Bible. Very important moment. It's very interesting to me that whatever Jewish author is taking dictation from the Holy Spirit, I believe, at that moment, right? That's what he's writing, right? I am. God is saying, I'm not a mere being. I'm not just part of this universe, right? And so the reason why I went into this talk in response to what you asked, right? There, in a certain sense, if God is, there can be a world without a world, but there cannot be a world without God. Does that make sense? If we construe him properly. And this is what Anselm's struggling to do. Can we generate a proof of the existence of God, right, based upon the proper definition of God? Because I'm getting ahead a little bit, but this might be a good moment to cover a related, very important topic, because I'm betting some of you have had this question before, or you've been asked this question in coffee shops or downstairs in this very building or something like that. And that is, if everything has a cause, what caused God? You ever been asked that question? Atheists ask that question all the time. How would Anselm field that question? Would he think very highly of that question, given what you've seen thus far? Mark, go for it.
I would say probably not, because it's something that, like, the universe can't really conceive of. He is something that exists outside the realm of space and time.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. Maybe this kind of pulls. I think what I'm doing here kind of sounds like a mix between the what's it called?
Cataphatic and the apophatic
together.
Yeah. That we need both, right? But the apophatic push will say to this, and this is what I always tell people when they ask me this. I've been asked this at least 100 times now in my life, both in the classroom as well as outside the classroom. I was asked it just the other day by an old guy in a coffee shop, saw my books, we started chatting, and sure enough, here comes the question. If everything has a cause, and this is on my worksheet later too. We're kind of jumping ahead here, but this is a good moment. If everything has a cause, then what or who caused God? And some would say that question makes no sense with respect to God, because God is not, by definition now, is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. He's not a thing. He's not an item within the universe. You can't define God that. If something created God, then that's God. And then if you ask the same question of that God, right? And you come up with the name, the specific name of another God. Well, but that God then created that God, and so on. Well, and this is where the cosmological arguments, which we're going to get to in a little bit here, this is where they come in now. It's just you get into that infinite regress problem. And Aquinas has a great response to this infinite regress problem, which we'll get to.
This regress problem has an issue, but I think that reasoning is why this particular argument doesn't seem to work for me. Because when we talk about God not being able to be construed as like some object within a universe because he is beyond the universe or something like this, he's beyond space and time, then how can we possibly build our argument off of like this maximally great being existing in a possible world when God is supposed to exist beyond some world?
That's the point I'm making. Okay, is that Anselm's wording and people who use the same wording are now vulnerable because of the grammar they're using, the terminology, this notion of world, and putting God in it, right? In a sense, this is a problem with the language being used in the argument.
I see. So what you're saying is that like there's two things we mean by world. One would be like the physical space, the universe, or something like this, and then one world is something more like a conception of how something could be, or something.
Now, a conception of the entirety of all being. Okay. I know that's abstract, but
no, okay, yeah, sure.
There's no way around getting abstract at times, right? When for those of you who pray, do you always and of course, for those of us who are Christians, we have an advantage here, though we've never seen Jesus actually. We have actual stories of Jesus in 4 books of the Bible, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, right? And we can form some kind of image of God, right? While nevertheless still buying into what Anselm's trying to do here, right? Often when we pray, we may not have any image. I often don't, I got to be honest. Because I know that the Michelangelo, the famous painting, Sistine Chapel, right? God reaching out, and Moses. Is it Moses? Isn't it Moses? Or Adam? No, it's Adam. You're right. It's Adam, right? Reaching out, and they're almost touching, right? And God looks like that grandfather, that kind of crazy grandfather we all want, right? The long flowing gray hair, and he's fierce and bold, and yet we also tend to imagine him as gentle and kind, right? Yeah, but that's not. God doesn't have a body, right? Which is what makes. I mean, we can't digress into this just yet, but nevertheless, let's just say the more you talk about God in these ways that we're doing tonight, for those of us who are interested in deepening our faith in Christianity or trying to understand Christianity more, it's interesting in that talk about God makes the incarnation of Jesus Christ more mysterious to me. I mean, and just more impactful, that this God without a body, God, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, could fully embody himself and finitize himself within a human being. Wow, it's pretty amazing. But that was really good. You're already anticipating a lot of stuff here. That was excellent. So, One important assumption that often is left out of the discussion is the equation between thought and being, as well as between being and goodness. It's this idea that ideas can have substance, they can have reality. Although we live in a culture that locates reality deep within the self, we do live it, right? We live in that. And that's why I brought this book tonight. I was just alerted to this book by a scholar whose talk I went to about a month ago, and I got a hold of it a couple weeks later. Carl Trueman, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. This is one of the best books I've read in years. And the way he lays out and traces the history of how we've arrived at the culture we have now, it's amazing. But that's what he talks about. He talks about how the sexual revolution we're undergoing in culture right now is not a sexual revolution. It's a self-revolution. It's a revolution of how we understand the self. It's fascinating. So, just in case that little tidbit piques your interest, okay? So although we live in a culture that locates reality deep within the self, that same self-reality is not located in thought generally, but in feeling. That's what Truman talks about. We tend to distrust our thoughts even when they seem valid or even sound. We tend to distrust our thought. Thought doesn't have reality, right? There's a trick here, right? I've encountered so many, especially recently, in the recent teaching I've done. It is amazing to me how unimpressed by good arguments students are today. And I'm not trying to pick on anyone. I'm just saying this is culturally what I'm encountering at this point, okay? They're not wowed by logic. I know when I first encountered logic in philosophy, I was like, wow, look what logic can do. 2 + 3 truly equals 5, right? Only in language, right? I was wowed by things like this, right? Not today. So let's log that, and we'll come back to this. We're not going through this all of this entire thing. I just gave all of this to you. Some of it's just for you, okay? So we tend to distrust our thought, even though in Anselm's day, a good argument, a good logical, valid, and sound argument meant it's true. There's a lot of confusion about this, by the way. I don't have this on the sheet. This is just now popping into my head. But let's cover this real quickly. There's a lot of confusion today about the difference between truth and fact. I hear this all the time. Evolution is a fact. Or evolution is not a fact. Depending on who you talk, right? As someone who's connected with many a professional professor, scientist, physicist, biologist, zoologist, paleontologist, philosophers of science, etc., anthropologists, I can tell you that no self-respecting scientist who believes and teaches evolution will call it a fact. You want to know why? Because what's the alternative? And you hear this with creationists a lot too. Evolution is only a theory. What's wrong with that statement? It's the word only. A theory, and some of you are in science, right? Right? A theory is actually a good thing.
Yeah.
It's a good status to have in science, right? Quantum physics, as mysterious as it is, as a set of related theories and an overall umbrella theory, it is one of the most verified, historically speaking, theories in the history of science. I have lots of physicist friends. I even talked with Hugh Ross about this. Quantum physics is a really good theory. It's highly, highly, highly likely true, has truth, but it's not a fact. Because facts, and you may want to take this down as a note, at least this is what I'm going to maintain. Facts I simply define as observables. Observables. Okay? Things you can actually observe. That's what a fact is. So it's directly related to our capacity for empirical experience and verification. Does that make sense, everyone? So let's just say, for the sake of a quick example here, I've got two fossils here. And this fossil is slightly more crude or rudimentary, and this fossil clearly related in structure, but it seems a little more complex and developed, let's just say. The fact is, these fossils look these two ways, right, with those observable features. The theory comes along, namely evolution, and interprets those facts. Does that make sense? And makes sense of them. That's the big difference, okay? So I will not be maintaining tonight that God exists is a fact. It's not. I will be maintaining that these arguments give us the truth. Truth is a more complex sort of thing, okay? Does that make sense? Yeah. Truth is a more complex sort of thing. That if facts are small, truth is big. Okay. So, well, one problem I think a lot of people have with this argument, this is at the bottom of the sheet now, with this ontological argument, is that God seems really abstract here. Just who or what is that than which nothing greater can be conceived? And those are the letters of that. I sometimes use all the letters, or sometimes I just put NGC down. Nothing greater conceived, okay? But that's a big problem. Just what features does this God have, right? Because Anselm does not mention omniscience. Not in that portion of the argument. In the larger context of those two books, he does, but not in that portion of the argument. He doesn't mention omniscience, omnipotence, or morally perfect. He doesn't mention, those are more specific cataphatic affirmations of God's nature, right? Okay? All right. Now we're ready to, and this is where we're going to be doing some skipping. I gave you, first of all, front and back, this is the famous text from St. Thomas Aquinas, okay? He's a 13th, he comes a century after Anselm. St. Thomas Aquinas, 1224 to 75, something like that. I'm forgetting that. But he's 13th century. And he famously came up with 5 ways, demonstrations, proofs of God's existence. And this is that slice of text, okay, from that. I'm only going to read small portions of this, and we're only going to go over the first way as a paradigm for the others, okay? I'll summarize the others. But let's look at the objections here. So Aquinas he wrote in a day when the writing style of the time, the writing method, was called a disputational style. You wrote down a question, you took a position on the question, you entertained objections, rebutted those objections, and then concluded. It's actually a very good way to write a paper, by the way. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses that's what he was doing. They were still in that tradition. 95 things he was going to dispute with the church. Does that make sense? In public debate. Okay? So that's what he's doing here. This comes from his famous book, the Summa Theologica. Objection 1. So the question is whether God exists. By the way, too, another quick thing. Aquinas usually thought there were many objections to the questions he covered. This is very interesting. Many objections. He usually narrowed them down to only 3, even though there were many more for all these questions he's covering, right? There are only 2 objections here. I find that fascinating. One of the most brilliant philosophers in human history thinks there are only 2, not at least 3 or more, main objections to the existence of God. Let's look and at least see what he thinks are the good objections. Objection 1. It seems that God does not exist because if one of 2 contraries be infinite, the other would be altogether destroyed. But the word God means that he is infinite goodness. If therefore God existed, there would be no evil discoverable. But there is evil in the world, therefore God does not exist. Can you tell what this problem is? This is the problem of evil, right? It's stated much more abstractly, right? But that's what he's dealing with there, right? So Thomas Aquinas takes that objection seriously. Now, objection 2. Further, it is superfluous to suppose that what can be accounted for by a few principles has been produced by many. But it seems that everything we see in the world can be accounted for by other principles, supposing God did not exist. For all natural things can be reduced to one principle, which is nature, and all voluntary things can be reduced to one principle, which is human reason or will. Therefore, there is no need to suppose God's existence, right? How would you summarize this one?
If you can explain the world without God involved in it.
Yeah, this would be the scientistic, right, notion that's so popular today. Put it very bluntly this way. But what, Mr. Theist, what if the universe, the physical material universe itself, is eternal, is infinite, right? That's what, and he's getting that, by the way, because something historically interesting happens by the 13th century. European intellectuals start interacting with Muslim and Arabic intellectuals and Jewish intellectuals from Northern Africa, Egypt, the Middle East, places like that. And some of them are at least entertaining ideas, even though they are serious Muslim philosophers. And as you know, Islam and Christianity at least shares one major feature, right? In that they believe in one God only, right? And this God is utterly transcendent. They agree on that, okay? So they're intensely interested in what each other has to say. And it is so sad that this kind of talk doesn't happen much anymore, because it was, though the debates could get pretty intense at times, it was always friendly, believe it or not, at least amongst the intellectuals. They respected each other. Aquinas had immense respect for the Arabic philosophers. So, okay. So those are the two objections. On the contrary, it is said in the person of God himself, quote, I am who am, unquote, Exodus 3:14. I answer that the existence of God can be proven in 5 ways. Let's just do the first one. I want to do the first because it kind of encapsulates the others. And he even says, the first and more manifest, more obvious, actually the Latin word here, this should be translated as palpable, if you know what that word means. Isn't that interesting? The Latin actually should be translated, the first and most palpable way is the argument from motion. It is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion. Notice how he's starting. Is he starting the same way that Anselm did? No, he's saying, observe. What do you observe? Something we observe every day in the world is motion. Technically, too, you could easily translate this as change. Okay? Motion or change. Now, whatever is in motion or whatever changes is put in motion or is changed by another. For nothing can be in motion except it is in potentiality to that towards which it is in motion, whereas a thing moves inasmuch as it is in act. So all he's saying there, he's using a distinction from Aristotle. So Aristotle gets reintroduced to the West at the time of Aquinas, and it changed philosophy and science forever, because Aristotle is a rather different philosopher from Plato. And Aristotle believed that part of the nature of a thing is the fact that it's always in some actual state, but it's in potentiality for any number of other states, okay? And that's all part of its nature. Very simple example would be A puddle of water, H2O. Think about the physics and the chemistry of H2O, what we know about it a little bit, right? It is actually in the liquid state of being, right? But in potentiality, it can become what or what we know.
Ice or vapor.
It can become a solid or a vapor, a part of the air, right? Yeah. Does that make sense? So potentially, depending on circumstances or conditions, right, it can actually change into one or these other potentialities, okay? That's what Aquinas is saying here. For motion or change is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. But nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. So something cannot change another thing unless that something doing the changing is in an actual state. You can't change anything when you're only in a potential state, right? So water, a puddle of water can't make your foot wet, right? If it's only potentially a puddle of water, if it's vapor. See what he's getting at here? It's got to, only actuality can change something else into another actuality. So this is part of the metaphysics of the time. Okay? And by the way, in case you think this is just obsolete ways of thinking, Aristotle's making a huge comeback right now. He has been for a few decades, actually. I just went to a conference recently where that was the talk. What does Aristotle have to say about modern science? It was a great conference. So it was at Salou. Thus, that which is actually hot as fire makes wood, which is potentially hot, to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it. Now, it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. For what is actually hot cannot simultaneously be potentially hot, but it is simultaneously potentially cold. It is therefore impossible that in the same respect and in the same way a thing should be both mover and moved, i.e., that it should move itself. Nothing can move itself or change itself. Therefore, whatever is in motion or is in process of changing must be put in motion or into that process of change by another, something external to it. If that by which it is put in motion be itself put in motion, then this also must needs be put in motion by another, and that by another again. And now, pay attention to this line. But this cannot go on to infinity. You may want to highlight that. A lot of people question that part of the argument. Why not? Because then there would be no first mover, and consequently no other mover, seeing that subsequent movers move only inasmuch as they are put in motion by the first mover, as the staff moves only because it is put in motion by the hand. Therefore, it is necessary to arrive at a first mover, put in motion by no other, and this everyone understands to be God. Do you follow the general thrust of this argument? And I've got, on the other sheet, that's the text, but I have the outline of the main moves in the argument in the other handout. The first way, argument from motion. Okay? And, we don't need to go over every single step. Look at it. The second way, I won't read, and I'm not even going to go over all the steps. I'm just going to summarize. But the second way is similar in that it's argument from efficient causation. Efficient causation is the way we normally think of causation. This is efficient causation right here. My hand applying a certain angle of force to this pen, and the pen can't help but behave in the way it does, right? Depending on the angle and the force I apply. That's called velocity, actually, if you know your physics, right? Yeah. So, right? And so, my hand is the efficient cause of the pen behaving that way. Aquinas thinks, like Aristotle, though, that everything that happens involves three other forms of causation, and that's what these other ways are all dealing with. Efficient is only one of them. Efficient causation is the only way we think of causation today, because we're materialists. We just believe there's just stuff. There's stuff and there's energy. There's stuff and there's force, and that's it. The medievals and the Greeks were more complex thinkers. They believed in not only efficient causation, they believed in formal causation, material causation, and final or teleological, or causation according to telos, that's the Greek word, final causation. I'll explain quickly what each of these means. Everything that happens has to have some stuff that it happens to. That's the material cause. Everything that happens has a shape or a form, a design, something like that. Nothing is purely shapeless. Not even atoms or subatomic particles. They all, for all of their weirdness, nevertheless have some form to them. And then everything acts towards some direction. And the more intelligent the thing is that we're talking about, the more they are self-directed towards fulfilling their own nature. That's the teleological aspect of causation. So rabbits do rabbity things to become more rabbity. Okay, I know that's, yeah, but it really is, right? Wolves do wolfish things to become more wolfish. Human beings are different, though. We're more complicated. We have an element to our being that the animals and the plants and the minerals don't have. We have a moral or normative element to our being. There are not just things that are true about us, but things that ought to be true about us, right? We ought to be honest and truth-telling, for example, right? We ought to be loyal and faithful to one another, right? We ought to be compassionate, things of that sort, right? We ought to preserve innocent life, etc., things of that sort, right? And so I always like to make this comment at this juncture. In a certain sense, minerals, plants, and animals cannot fail to be who and what they are. They can, but they do so only because some external agent hinders them from doing it, right? A bigger wolf comes along and beats up the smaller wolf, or maybe even kills it, right? Because it sees it as a threat or a challenge or something, right? Or an animal gets sick, accidentally gets a disease and dies, or something like that. But human beings are the only thing that can fail freely to become their own natures, okay? Well, so the second way is the argument from efficient causation, where it's very much like the argument from motion. It seems like we can't extrapolate motion back towards infinity in the past, right? And this is where your book and your presentation is so helpful, right? And the way you talk about infinite time, eternity, right, versus finite time, right? But we can't go back to infinity, right? And we can talk about that if you have an issue with that. A lot of people have an issue with that. And so if we're going to get this thing called it seems like, in other words, let me put it this way. If we can't go back infinitely into the past in terms of motion and change, it seems like at some point we have to see that there had to have been an unmoved mover, right, to start this whole chain of causation in the first place, i.e., through some act of creation. And the same thing with the second way. We can't project efficient causation back to infinity, so there must be a first cause. And that's the way Aquinas puts that. So unmoved mover, first cause. The third way can be summarized as not everything can just be a mixture of actuality and potentiality or possibility. Okay? Otherwise, we go back to infinity again. How does it all get started again? Something has to be a necessary being. And then the fourth way deals with gradations of being. Are there some things that are hot that are hotter than other hot things? Yes. Is there something hotter possibly than that? Yeah. Are there? So, for example, we know our sun is pretty hot, but there are other stars out there that are much hotter, right? Is there something hotter than those suns? And so do we talk about these kinds of gradations only in terms of gradation, or is there a point of perfection? This becomes especially important if we're talking about moral qualities. Are there only gradations of goodness, but no perfect goodness? Do you want to live in a universe like that? I'm going to come back to that question. And then the fifth way is known as the way of the argument from design. This is known as the teleological argument. That all of nature and the things within nature exhibit not chance but design. And I'm sure other people have presented on that with you guys, right? There are more and more scientists are coming out and just saying, you look at the constants of the universe, and if they were off by just a smidgen, do you know some of this kind of material? They were off just by the slightest. If the strong nuclear force that holds together the nuclei of atoms were just a little bit different, there would be no universe. Other constants, if they were violated or changed even slightly, you might get a universe, but you're not going to get life. You get a cold, dead universe, and so on. I think the evidence is in. This universe is designed. Okay? We're going to come back to this still, and I know we got started a little late, but yeah. So that's kind of and you can see though, there's a general thrust of all five of these arguments, and part of it has to do with Aquinas finds it very unlikely that we can project reality back infinitely, right? In a merely material sense. Even though he entertains that objection in the beginning, right? He thinks that's highly unlikely. Why that is, we're going to get to in just a moment. So, well, let's answer the first quick question on my sheet, though. Does this look like an apophatic approach or a cataphatic? This is clearly what? This approach from Aquinas, these five ways. Unlike Anselm, Hannah, Anselm was apophatic, right? God is that than which nothing, there's the negative, by the way, the no thing. No thing can be conceived any greater than this being, right? So Anselm, again, is always pushing things in direction of the negative. Oh, you think God's an item in the universe? Well, that's not God by definition. God's way greater than that. See the apophasis there, right? But here, Aquinas wants to say positive things about God. This is cataphatic. This is cataphasis, right? Make sense? What are those five things again? God is the unmoved mover. Enough space. God is the unmoved mover. God is the first cause. God is the one necessary being, right? God is the perfection of all grades of being. So he's not only a necessary being, I'll just go ahead and call him the perfect being. And that is especially important when it comes to morality or moral goodness, right? I start, just to let you know, the preface, the 20-page preface of my dissertation is of all people, I reflect on the way Plato talks about perfection in the divine. And if there is no perfect goodness running this universe, folks, then we have this scary thought to entertain. Then goodness really does become like what the culture seems to think that it's about, and that is the assertion of power. There are three logical possibilities here. Either there's a perfect goodness, or there's nothing at all like that, or this perfect goodness actually isn't so perfect, is imperfect in some way, and needs power as a special addition to it. I don't know about you, but those last two don't seem very inviting to me. They don't seem to be. That's certainly not how the Bible lays out the picture of God.
Can you talk about that third point a little bit more, regarding the assertion of power being necessary for like enforcing some imperfect goodness?
Well, we live in a culture that has thought this way about moral and political goodness for a while now. Justice, all of these practical ethical concepts, right? And that is, everything's a power structure, right? Either you're oppressor or oppressed. And what must the oppressed do once they become conscious of their oppression? This is Marxism, right? This is Marx. They have to rebel. They have to revolt, right? We need the revolution, right? And so now we live in an era, right, where we're witnessing multiple simultaneous revolutions right now, right? Much of it, I would say, rebellion against the created order of things. In fact, if I could go back to, I know you haven't read it, but if I could just pick a moment, a really key moment in the Brothers Karamazov, in one of the key chapters, when the cold atheist brother, Ivan Karamazov, is talking with his younger Christian, monkish, he's a monk actually, brother, Alyosha is his name. And Alyosha says, you're talking like an atheist. And Ivan says, no, I'm not an atheist. I believe in God, he says. I believe God exists. What I don't believe in is his created order of things. That's what I'm rebelling against. That's exactly what we're seeing in the culture today. I know it's just a mere anecdote. I don't know how much to believe this or not, but the daughter of the infamous Joseph Stalin, said this on multiple occasions later on in life, that when he was dying in his deathbed, moments before he finally passed away, he raised his fist to the ceiling and shook it, she said, like this, and opened his eyes and just shook it at the sky. So, something to think about at least. So we get 5, well, then the 5th one is intelligent designer or master designer, if you want to use that word. We've got now 5 positive characteristics of God, right? All from reason. We're not looking at the Bible to get these. We're just using reason, according to Aquinas, right? God is the unmoved mover. He's the first cause of all things. Necessary being, let's talk about that for just a moment. This is the Latin term for this is aseity. It means a couple of things. It means not being caused by something else, okay? And it means you don't just happen to exist, but that you exist necessarily, right? That as the video said, if there were such a thing as possible worlds, and again we talked about the world that with the world talk, there's a problem there. Obviously, God's not an item in this world, right? He's the creator of them, of all these possible worlds, right? But just to talk that way for a moment, if there were such a thing as possible worlds, to have necessary being or necessary existence, would mean that it is entailed in all those worlds that God exists. Otherwise, God is not God. Otherwise, you haven't. Then Anselm would step to the fore and say, "You haven't thought about God long enough. You're thinking about God is not big enough. You're making your God too small." And that even is not necessarily a good way to talk about God, because it gives him size. God doesn't have size. He's not big or small. Those are metaphors, right? Make sense? Right, interesting. Yeah. So that's what notice I put in quotation marks the word thing. God is by definition not a thing. If you're thinking of him as a thing, then you're not thinking big enough about God. And so partly what I'm trying to argue here, the complementarity now, just to get away from the handout for a moment, maybe in the interest of time, summarize a little bit. What I see in these two thrusts of argument is complementarity. Traditionally, these have been seen as contesting ways of looking at God. And I'll be honest with you, the ontological argument has come under more heat and scrutiny, as you might imagine. It looks like a parlor trick to many people. I don't think it is. I think it's at least a very valid argument and probably sound, personally, okay? But generally, the cosmological arguments have fared better in the history of philosophy. Does that make sense? There are more philosophers who would say, yeah, I'll sign on to the cosmological. I'm not so sure about the ontological. I think they're both good, is my point. And I think they work complementary because when it feels like God's too abstract, we need Aquinas, right? We need a cosmological approach. We need someone to step in and say, here are the positive attributes of God. Here's who you're praying to. Unmoved mover, first cause, necessary being, perfectly good being, and a masterful designer of universes. Even without the Bible, that's a pretty good set of traits to be praying to, I think, if I were just a general rationalistic theist type person. See what I'm saying? Of course, now you can see, too, how revelation and reason complement one another as well. The Bible steps in and says, oh, yeah, when we talk about God's moral goodness, actually what we're talking about is love. Well, that's even more specific. We all love love, right? Love is great, right? So, on the other hand, when things seem to get too particularized, too smallish, too anthropomorphic. Do you know this word? I'm running out of space. Anthro, A-N-T-H-R-O-P-O, anthropo, where we get anthropology, meaning man, morph, meaning change, or body, anthropomorphic. What it means to anthropomorphize God is to turn God into too human a figure, right? And as you know, many atheists think that's what we're doing. That's what us theists or Christians or Jews or Muslims, right? That's what we're doing. We're just anthropomorphically projecting God in our thought system, right? In our minds, right? That's all we're doing. And here, by the way, nice interjection here. I think this is, for years I actually was haunted by that objection. I read a book when I was studying theology. It scared the crap out of me. Ludwig Feuerbach, late 18th, early 19th century philosopher, wrote a book called The Essence of Christianity. And that was his argument. All of religion is anthropomorphic projection. And I thought, oh my goodness, what if that's true? See, this was my period of doubt and everything. What if that's true? What if that's true? How can I ever know that I'm not just projecting this? And then years later, it occurred to me when I was debating some atheists. And it was very obvious to me that they didn't like God because they wanted to live their lives in the way they wanted to live. Sound familiar? Right? It occurred to me to ask them if they were anthropomorphizing God, right? Their atheism was an anthropomorphic projection of what their own desires were, which was to live their lives sexually as they pleased, right? Materially as they pleased, politically, morally. Even one of them said, I think it's okay to lie now and then. I mean, if it's in your best interest. Yeah, I remember him saying that. Do you see what I'm getting at? So this is not a slam dunk argument. It works both ways. If that's what you're going to argue, it works both ways. Right? See what I'm getting at? So, well, a lot of people think, here's part of the complementarity as well. A lot of people think that it seems like Aquinas is presupposing God is the exception to all of these rules, right? Everything both moves and is moved. Well, doesn't that apply to God? You're just excluding God because that fits your purpose, suits your purpose. Everything is both causes and is caused. Everything is contingent, etc. But God's the great exception. Why should we make that leap? Enter Anselm. Because God, by definition, is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And if there's any truth to that, then God would be an unmoved mover. He would be the exception to the rule, right? He would be the first cause. What else would it mean to be God, right? He would be the one true necessary being. He would be the perfectly moral being. He would be the master designer, right? So, this infinite regress problem, is it logically possible? I'm going to say yes. The people who believe in infinite regression, the infinite regress, yeah. It's a possible description of reality. Possibly. But does it explain anything? No. That's what Aquinas is getting at when he says this can't go on to infinity. Because he's trying to explain, right? Not just describe. I'll tell you what, when I hear atheists talk about multiverses and bubble universes and baby universes and all of these for one thing, there's not a shred of scientific evidence for any of that. It's all speculation. I've talked with plenty of astrophysicists about this. It's all speculation. And they're speculating that because they refuse to believe in a God who, if they did believe in them, would have to become master of their lives, right? See the point? So do you see anything resembling the ontological argument here? Yeah, God is the great exception to all these other beings, right? And so now I come to the final part of my talk tonight. Going beyond validity and soundness. I think these arguments are not only valid and sound. I'm asking you, of course, what you think. I hope we still do have some time to talk about this a little bit. But do you find them persuasive? Do you find them convincing? Or perhaps even convicting? I find these arguments convicting. Do you see the differences between those? A lot of people hear these arguments and they shrug their shoulders. I said in my abstract at the beginning of the evening that the problem with these arguments is not a problem with the arguments. It's a problem with the people listening to the arguments. We're not convinced by these arguments because I believe there's a problem with human nature, right? And though I think it's good that we're not analysis robots, if we were, we would, I think, find these arguments convincing. What kind of belief would that be, though? See, there's your AI. There's your AI. I believe in these arguments. They sound very, right, to talk like a robot for a moment, right? Yes, these are convincing, but that's not. We're more than that, right? And I'm not just talking actually about just mere emotion here, getting involved. It's way more than that. Alvin Plantinga, who was mentioned in the video, the guy I mentioned earlier, the retired professor at Notre Dame, he actually argues that we have a sensus divinitas, each within us, that God created, a divine sense, a sense built just for him. The problem today is people don't cultivate it. And that's why they're not open to these arguments, I would say. We're in rebellion, right? Yeah.
So you've studied other religions.
Yeah.
How do other, because I'm not really familiar with gods in other religions. Like, how do they compare to the God that we would attribute all of these qualities
Yeah. That's one thing I like about the rational approach to God. I have to admit, as passionate as I am, and I do believe Christianity is the truth. I'm just going to say that. I take very seriously Jesus' statement in the 14th chapter, the 6th verse of the Gospel of John, when he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through me. I take that seriously. That said, as someone who's taught world religions multiple times, including recently at Fontbonne, I find beauty in other religions. If I had to pick one, I really like Hinduism in ways, even though it's got a lot of problems in the metaphysics. But what I feel like, certainly the three great monotheisms all agree. This is why Aquinas took the Arabs so seriously, because they agreed, generally. There were a few outliers who were questioning this stuff, but they generally agreed with these traits. In fact, Aquinas' work was very well received in the Middle East. Very well received. And same with the Jews. There's a famous Jewish medieval philosopher. Do you know his name? Maimonides? Maimonides. Maimon, Maimonides, Ides. We have a lot of his work that survived too. He's interesting Jewish medieval philosopher. In a large degree. Remember, that important verse from Exodus, that's a Jewish text, right? Personally, if I can just interject this too, I just feel like saying this. I call my Jewish friends my Jewish brothers and sisters. I feel like, I can't tell if we're brothers and sisters or cousins or what, but I feel like God is saving them too. I don't know. I know that is in tension with what I said a moment ago about John, but nevertheless, I do feel that way. And I respect my Muslim friends too, my intellectual Muslim friends they all agree with this kind of stuff. They think we can get to God through reason. Reason is a gift from God too, right? And I think all too often what's happening in our colleges and universities today is students haven't gotten any of this in school or from the home, and then they get into their postmodern classrooms, right, in college, where everything's questioned and there's a lot of sloppy thinking, right, where God is thought of as an item within the universe. Show me where this God is. I get this all the time. Well. And they're just not ready for it. That's why clubs like this are so important. And I'm not here to coerce or badger anyone into belief. That's not at all. But I want you guys to be able to make a true choice. God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I'll put it that way, he deserves a fair hearing too, right? So it's a great question. I don't know if I'm fully really answering. I believe the other, and as far as Hinduism, now some strands of Buddhism actually are fairly atheistic. Some of that actually has a good impulse to it. I'll try and explain it this way. So one of my favorite thinkers from the 20th century was both a Buddhist and a Catholic. He was a Catholic monk. His name is Thomas Merton, Merton. And Merton saw within Buddhism a kind of purifying element in his thought, because Buddhists were very wary of any picture of God. Again, it's that apophatic element. Does that make sense? And so what I'm striving to do here tonight is try and maybe I'm asking as a question, is it possible to find a balance between the apophatic and the cataphatic, right? Where we're careful not to constrain God too much, right? And we're careful, on the other hand, not to
To make them unattainable. Or something.
make him unattainable either. That's a good way to put it. If we make him too attainable, right, then it seems like we're anthropomorphizing. If we make him unattainable, then what connection do we have? I know I'm dropping a lot of names and books. I am sorry. It's just my habit, folks. I love, and here's why. My principal mentor, Dr. Gene Fent at the University of Nebraska, he said this at the beginning of one of our classes on syllabus day. He said at the end, "You will not be finished in the course of this semester." That's what a university is for, to give you assignments for life. And that's what I'm doing. I'm giving you more stuff to look up on your own, in your own quest. C.S. Lewis wrote a book very important book called The Problem of Pain. It was his book on theodicy, on the problem of suffering. And in the book titled Divine Goodness, he lays out this tension. On the one hand, if we speak too easily about how we understand God, morally speaking, we tend to put too many limits on God. And we tend to be too easy on ourselves. Like, God's not really upset with sexual sin. God's not really upset with lying. He's not upset if I waste 14 hours playing video games. That kind of thing doesn't. See, we anthropomorphize him because that's how we're thinking, right? On the other hand, if we say, there's really nothing we can say about divine goodness, the nature of it, now it seems like we have no real connection or relationship with him. How can we even know what he expects of us then? See? So it's a real tension, but I'm trying to walk that tension tonight. I'm doing it more in the theoretical realm, but it certainly is very important in the moral realm as well. Yeah.
Well, as you're saying that, something interesting came into my mind. So it says in the Bible, we are made in the image of God, not the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas they're sort of saying God is made in the image of man. So that's just something that's written in the Bible that I thought relates to this.
Yeah, no, Ivan Karamazov talks a lot about that. Did God make man or did man make God? See, Feuerbach says man made God. And that became a very popular idea from him onwards. I mean, it existed before that. In fact, there were even atheist Greeks, by the way. The original formulation of the problem of suffering actually comes to us from a guy named Epicurus. Whole philosophy is named after him, Epicureanism. Epicurus said, if God is all good, given the evidence of suffering and evil, then he can't be all-powerful. Or if he's all-powerful, given the evidence of suffering and evil, he can't be all good. Because if he were all good, he would want to prevent and or eliminate all suffering and evil. If he were all-powerful, he'd be able to. But we have suffering and evil. So either he lacks power, goodness, both, or existence altogether. That's that 2 pages in a nutshell. I've done that so many times I can do it in my sleep now. But that's Epicurus's. That's the famous formulation in the history of Western philosophy of the problem of suffering. It comes from Epicurus. Yeah. I actually would love to teach a course. And I've asked to do this and I've been denied every time. I would love to teach world religions with this focus. Because there are books out there, particularly there's a Jewish author named Neustadt. Joseph, I think his first name is Joseph Neustadt, who has written a book on the world religions and how they differ and agree both in their approaches to the problem of suffering. But I've been told, see, this is the environment we live in now, though. You wouldn't believe how administrators actually think about places like this and people like you. They think you can't handle this topic. I'm not kidding. I've been told this many times. I really fought hard just to teach my seminar on the problem of suffering when I was at Lindenwood for 12 years. I eventually got to teach it 3 times, but they didn't want me to teach, and they didn't want me to call it even the problem of evil or the problem of suffering. I had to give it some other name. I can't remember what it was. It was sad. You know, administrators are, in large part, they're deceivers, and they don't believe in the very thing they're supposed to be cultivating, which is education. I'm not trying to be overly negative there, folks, but it needs to be said. Yeah, Mark?
Yeah, I completely agree. This is the problem with like our modern day culture, and this is what,
Right.
interestingly, what Mark and I were talking about as the tornado siren was going on.
Yeah.
It's like the administrators, or just the culture at large, wants to protect us for our own good, but sometimes that's actually kind of ironically harming us at the same time because we're not exposed to things that strengthen us or empower us in some way.
Yeah. No, that's, you know what, this will be my final point then. If you look on the handout, I do raise one more issue at the end here. And to my knowledge, this is something original. I hope it. I don't know. I don't get it. I haven't had a chance to fully look at the possible literature. But it's the feature of what I call the attractiveness of a theory or a worldview. And I'm asking the question first I'm asking the question, what's attractive about a view according to you, X person, whoever I'm talking with? And why do you find it attractive? But in addition to those questions, I want to ask the question, can attractiveness serve as a criterion for the truthfulness of some view? Is it possible that atheism is true, and regardless of all the fancy, seemingly neato things I'm saying here tonight, I'm wrong? Is that possible? Absolutely. That's possible. But is atheism an attractive view? I will speak only for myself. One reason why I never made the leap to atheism is it was so unattractive to me. It seemed hopeless. It was nihilistic to me. Do you know this word nihilism? If atheism is true, when I cease being, I cease being. But if this is all true, I get to live on in the way Mr. Taylor has talked about in some of his, I'm sure you know his presentation on what it means to be eternal, to live eternally. Do I know 100% for certain that that's true? No. I don't know that your view is true for certain, with absolute certainty in the way we normally think about certainty, right? But is it attractive? You bet. And does that attractiveness serve as an additional criterion that helps support its truthfulness? Is the more attractive view, is the most attractive view, whatever that view may be. Maybe it's Buddhism, maybe it's Hinduism, I don't know, right? I find Christianity the most attractive. I think it's the most beautiful that Jesus would die on the cross for me. And then not only do I get to live eternally as some disembodied soul in some disembodied state in heaven, but the Bible says I get my body back someday in some glorified way that'll be free from pain, suffering, aging, that's a big one, dying, death, right? I get that back for eternity. That's awfully attractive. Is that speaking to my sense of beauty that's also God-given? And does that serve as further support for its truthfulness? I'm going to say yes.
Do you ever worry about that? So, like,
I do.
For me, look,
Yeah.
like, I personally value attractiveness of some view quite a lot. Like, when I look at even just like something that's not really just like a political view or a philosophical view or a moral view, if something feels attractive to me, in many ways, I'm more drawn to it. I think that, like, well, my intuition is telling me this.
Yeah.
Sometimes when I'm having an argument, I'll say, like, well, it seems like this is the case. Maybe not grounded in any, like,
Yeah.
but, okay, so to skip forward a little bit, for me, attractiveness is also a problem because
Hmm.
you could come up with a situation where someone might say, "Man, Christianity is really attractive, but it could be more attractive if he just didn't care so much about sexual sin
Yeah.
or something like that." And then
No, yeah.
all of a sudden, you have a situation where, like, it may be the case that this new quasi Christianity
Yeah.
is more attractive to that individual.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it goes against the teachings of Christianity in the first place. And
Yeah.
so, like, is this an issue with like this idea of like attractiveness being a criterion for truth? I think that maybe a better statement would be something like attractiveness is a heuristic or an indicator of truth. That
Yeah,
isn't
no,
always-
and that may be what it's. I'm not trying to say it's demonstratively that way. You're making a very nice distinction. I can't believe I just heard an undergraduate you accurately use the word heuristic. This is the most fun I've had in a very long time. You guys are outstanding. But no, that you actually, yeah, I think that's what I mean by it. It's more of an heuristic, and that's a good way to put it. But to me, that still speaks to its truthfulness. But then I would have to give an account, right, of how can an heuristic add to the truthfulness of something that's more demonstrative? What's the relationship between the two?
so
Because
how do you-
Aquinas and Anselm are both giving us demonstrations, right? They're offering this as some kind of logical proof. Does that make sense? Right? Not as just an heuristic, right?
Yeah, I think that could be the case. I
Yeah.
just really worry about like the attractiveness argument because
Yeah.
like this isn't exactly the same thing, but like earlier I heard you say something like we reject these arguments not because they're bad or faulty arguments, but because we are faulty in our nature, and I think there's something powerful about that. But at the same time, I worry about making statements like that, or making statements like you're not believing in this argument, this ontological argument, because you're rebelling against God. I remember you saying as well. The issue with that is that like I can conceive of some Christians saying, "Yeah, I'm a Christian. I believe in God. I believe
Yeah.
in arguments for God, but I don't believe in this one."
Right.
Well, now we have a situation,
And there are Christians who don't.
So now we have a situation where somebody is not rebelling
Yeah.
from God, and yet at the same time is rejecting this particular
Yeah.
line of argumentation.
Yeah, and my response to that would be, and I can't remember now I'll have to look at the tape. I don't know how forcefully I put it, but I would prefer, and I meant to ask it as a question. Do those of us who struggle to find these arguments either convincing or even plausible, because plausibility is even another level. I mean, when I encounter atheists or agnostics or skeptics of various sorts, and they give me an attitude of dismissiveness, see, that's even different, right? But I can't help but at least ask the question: is there something in you that's causing the problem? Is it really a problem with the arguments? And I just want to ask it as a question, right?
I think that is the important question.
And not
You
assert
said
it as a
something about
dogma.
Dismissiveness is the important part there, I think.
Right,
So, like,
right.
there's a difference between dismissing an argument
Right.
and simply not agreeing is not the right word, but not agreeing to the assumptions or the terminology of some argument. So, like, if I were to be dismissive of this argument entirely and say this is all garbage,
Yeah.
and I'm going to throw it away after I get done with this,
Yeah.
would be a different thing than saying like, well, what is a maximally great being? Another thing I was thinking is like, a maximally great being would probably be able to do things with significant handicaps. As an analogy, like I would find somebody like if Mark solved a Rubik's cube right now, I'd be like, that's pretty impressive. If he did so blindfolded, I'd be like, that's really, really impressive. And if he did so after like he span around a few times and maybe he's drunk on alcohol or something like this, and he's blindfolded and he solves the Rubik's cube, this is extremely impressive. And so the analogy there is like, okay, how many handicaps can a maximally great being take while still being a maximally great being? And you could conceive of a world where like a maximally great being is so great
Mm-hmm.
that they can take the handicap of not being great and being able to create the world. And if they're
Yeah.
not maximally great, then they aren't necessarily involved in all worlds, and so
Well,
now we have this situation.
I think, yeah. Number one, God does work under one severe handicap. He gave us free will, and He will never violate that. I'm not, and I don't want to digress into those handful of scriptural places where it seems like God is interfering, like with Pharaoh's free will. Those are special cases that we would have to talk about one precedent at a time, because each one of those situations is unique. And actually, my biblical scholarship's a little rusty right now. I've been focusing on this other stuff. That said, I truly do believe that God, in fact, God was the first creator of artificial intelligence, us.
Mm-hmm.
He gave us a capacity to resist Him if we so choose. And He will honor that choice. And when I said earlier at the beginning, when I was talking about the differences between goodness and power, in case this is a roadblock for any of you too, as it should be, by the way, part of the problem of evil is the problem of hell. Marilyn McCord Adams, who's now passed away, one of my favorite current philosophers, she was a ordained minister and a philosopher at Princeton, I believe. Marilyn McCord Adams. She wrote a book called Horrendous Evils and the Goodness of God. And she said the biggest problem in the problem of evil is not child abuse, which is what I focused on in mine, by the way, and not Holocausts and genocides and all these other things, horrific though those are. Hell is the biggest one, because we're talking about eternal suffering there. Okay? And I think she may be right. She makes a very serious argument for that. That said, I no longer believe that hell is a punishment imposed by God externally on agents who have rebelled against Him. I believe what hell is simply separation from God, self-chosen, and what actually happens in hell is the undoing of that agent's being that had been God given to them. And that's what they experience for eternity, if that makes any sense. It's so C.S. Lewis. I'm kind of getting a cue from Lewis again, who's been a big influence on me, in case that's not clear, where he likens hell to a soul burning in hell. If you want to stick with that metaphor, he likens it to a log burning in a fire for eternity, but never quite getting down to the last bit of wood. Does that make sense? It's the undoing of that person's being. And it's not God making that person burn. It's, okay, you don't want to be with me? There you go. C.S. Lewis even famously said, hell is not a door that's locked from without. It's locked from within. I think that's got to be true. Because I know a lot of people in your, generation in your, right? And rightly so. I understand why you're sensitive to it. It bothers me too. How can God punish someone for an eternity? Right? But try to imagine Hitler in heaven. How the heck would he enjoy the company of Mother Teresa and Martin Luther King and St. Francis and Mr. Mark Taylor here? You see what I'm getting at? How would he, right? So in other words, goodness outflanks power, sheer power, not by meeting it with an equal and greater power, but by meeting it with, okay, you want to be separate from me. Goodness is the center of the universe. It's what things run on. Good rabbits are very rabbity and very successful at being rabbity, right? At escaping predators like foxes and wolves and eating food and reproducing and all of that, right? Right? But imagine a rabbit with free will that doesn't want to be a rabbit, a God-created rabbit anymore, right? What would happen to that rabbit being separated from the power that created it and is supposed to sustain it? That makes sense? That's what hell is. And any thinking, again, that tries to see that goodness is not intrinsically its own fundamental power, I think is an error. You have to see goodness And even Plato sees this. He's a pagan, and he sees this very clearly. I always start with Plato. He's my guy. Plato's Republic is one of the greatest books ever written. If you don't, you got to read that some point in your life. And if you ever want to talk about it, get a hold of me through this guy or whatever, because I will talk forever and a day about that book. I've taught it many times. But Plato sees this. Power tries to separate itself from goodness, and as a result, it winds up destroyed. Look at Hitler. Did he take over the world? For a few years, he got close, or a good portion of it, right? But look how self-destructive he was. Just in what he did to his own country and the places he conquered, and right? Joseph Stalin was so paranoid as a tyrant. He knew deep down how evil he was. He was so paranoid that before Germany invaded Russia in World War II, he was so paranoid that his generals were trying to get rid of him or something. He killed like 3/4 of his generals, which is why Germany ran through Russia that first year. They had no leadership. Stalin killed them all, or most of them, out of his paranoia. Is that a strength? That doesn't sound like strength to me. It sounds like weakness, right? Evil people, Plato argues, evil, unjust people, if they achieve any goal together, they have to have some degree of justice between them. Otherwise, cooperation would be impossible. But God is asking for our free cooperation with Him, right? That's what He's doing, right? Yeah. So, yeah. I love thinking about the complementarities that I believe God has created. And I think there are complementarities within the reason that He's given us, and there are complementarities between reason and revelation, right? And you know, my hope, again, going back to your question, Hannah, too, I got to say, in spite of what John 14:6 says and other places say, I don't know if I'm just being soft here or what, but I don't know. It really is above our pay grade to say who's going to heaven and who's not, right? It really is. That's up to God. I don't want to usurp that seat of judgment. That's His. But I have never, ever, I've criticized logically, other religions and beautiful philosophies like Plato's. But I never, ever tell students, hey, don't look at that. Don't read that. Just read the Bible. No. By all means. If you ever want a reading list of anything, let me know. In Hinduism and Buddhism, Islam, the main book there is, of course, the Quran, right? And then the Bible covers two faiths, right? Judaism, which I generally refer to the Old Testament as the Hebrew Bible. I just think out of respect, I like to refer to it that way, I have so many Jewish friends. I really do. I have a lot of Jewish friends. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you worry that, again, that's an appeal to like the attractiveness of, like I said earlier, that like a Christian who wants to misconstrue Christianity such that like they allow for sexual immorality would be appealing to attractiveness rather than truth. And this is why I don't think that like attractiveness is a direct correlator with truth or something like this.
Yeah.
Now like you saying, despite what's said in John 14, I think that like my Jewish friends and my Muslim friends or what have you are going to go to heaven. I don't know if I quoted you exactly on that, but my point is that
It's a hope of mine.
Yeah.
I don't know that though.
Right. But okay.
Even Dante puts philosophers like Socrates not in hell but in limbo, a place called limbo. Have you guys read the Divine Comedy? There's a lot of thought in there. You should read. It's divided up into three, right? There's the Inferno. That's the Latin word for hell, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the Purgatorio, purgatory. He was a Catholic, so he believed in purgatory. I think purgatory is possible, by the way, but I construe it in a different way. And then there's the paradiso, or heaven, right? And there's a lot of Dante was quite the philosopher, actually. He was a philosopher as well as a poet, and he puts philosophers like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle in a place called limbo. It's kind of a neutral state. I'm just saying, even he couldn't put these noble thinkers who, you've mentioned sexual sin several times. I did too, and there's a reason why I pick on that. That's the culture's favorite desire, right? I'm getting this cue from a Catholic thinker named R. Reno. He teaches at Creighton University. He's a friend of mine. He's a brilliant philosopher. He's also chief editor of First Things, a Catholic journal of culture. You should check into. The essays are excellent. But Reno argues in a famous essay he wrote years ago that if you're going to teach, say, an intro to philosophy course, and you're going to change students' minds about the nature of morality, you've got to get them to think critically about sexuality. And not in the direction of the liberal, but in the direction of what has God ordained, both rationally and through revelation. Does that make sense? And I know it's a touchy subject. I get that. But there's even Aristotle was critical of the sexual libertinism of the Greeks in his time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he makes it very clear that adultery just is wrong. There's because if you know Aristotle's ethical theory at all, he argues that our desires, our basic natural desires, need to be expressed. We don't want to be deficient in the expression of our desires. So that's good to know. Sexual desire is natural to us. We should express it. So we need to avoid deficiency. Does that make sense? That's one pole or extreme he's trying to avoid. We also need to avoid excess. That's the other pole. We need to shoot for what he calls that golden mean. He uses a metaphor from math again. The Greeks loved mathematical metaphors. The golden mean, the golden median, right? Where we, as he says, we express that desire at the right time, towards the right people, with the right objects. These are what I call the 5 factors of Aristotle. With the right objects, in the right manner, and with the right telos, or purpose, or aim, or goal in mind. You do that, you express that desire virtuously. That's how you get to virtue. If a pagan like Aristotle can say that, then Christians can do it at least equally well, if not better. But what I'm seeing is a lot of excuse making.
I suppose that could be the case, but I guess. Okay, so here's a fundamental question for you.
Yeah.
As a Christian and also as a philosopher,
Mm-hmm.
how do you figure out when to refer to the Bible and when to refer to philosophers? And so, let me qualify that a little bit.
Yeah.
So, for a discussion about, say, sexual sin, you would probably, of course, you'd draw on philosophers as well as you just did, but I'm sure you'd probably quantify that in the Bible in some way, saying that there is some kind of moral truth that's attached to God, and this is manifested in the Bible or something like this.
Mm-hmm.
But for in the case of like Socrates and whatnot,
Yeah.
you referred directly to Dante and said even things like, even Dante had said something like this.
Right.
I wonder how you figure out, like, in what instances you should refer to a philosopher and what instances you should refer to the actual book. Because it could be the case to me that Dante got something wrong. I've never read Dante. My girlfriend's reading Dante right now, or was before, but I don't really remember.
You should borrow her book.
Yeah, I probably should. Yeah, but my point being is that, like, there's nothing that I know of that suggests that Dante got everything right. And so my problem with this reasoning is that, like, how can you say I just have a really good, attractive gut feeling that my Jewish friends aren't going to burn in hell, but also at the same time, sexual morality, look to the Bible and it tells you for certain that adultery is wrong.
You don't need that. You don't necessarily need the Bible for most of morality. And I say most of, and I know it's getting hot in here, and we're pushing 2 hours. But let me just say this. Let's go back to Aristotle again. Aristotle was not one of these ascetic kind of guys who thought you should skip meals and wear bad clothing and like some of the monastic or monkish behaviors that some of the orders in the Middle Ages, some of these he didn't believe in extreme behaviors. That said, he nevertheless argues that in order to actualize, you know what that word means now, to actualize your potentiality for good in the real world, you've got to know the good, which we all do, he says. We know what we ought to do. You've got to do it. You've got to act on that knowledge. And you've got to fully desire it. You've got to fully desire it. You can't be dragging your feet, because if you're doing it merely out of a sense of duty, after a while, you're probably going to stop doing that right thing because you're not enjoying it, right? I bring that up because guess what Jesus talks about in the famous Sermon on the Mount in chapters Matthew 5, 6, and 7, right? Yeah. That's Jesus's ethical treatise. And I've taught it. I've taught those 3 chapters in isolation in classes before, where it seems like this is where he famously says, "In the past it's been said, 'Thou shalt not commit adultery.' But I say, if you even think adulterous thoughts, you've committed adultery." And people today go, "What an unrealistic! What does he say? He's all wrong." Well, no, he's speaking to this rational construal. Because if you're watching your hot neighbor's wife, right, watering the flowers in her bikini and entertaining thoughts. And I'm not trying to be super racy here, folks.
Wait, the
I'm
hot
speaking to
neighbor's
the
wife or the neighbor's hot wife?
No, yeah.
No, sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's just that I got to say something here real quick.
Sure.
10, 20 years ago when I was teaching, I didn't have to give trigger warnings like this. I just did my job. Now today I seem like I have to do this. And I don't like it. Okay? I just want to do my job. So thank you for letting me say that. But Jesus is actually speaking to this, because if you're entertaining those kinds of thoughts, and the culture today says this all the time, it's okay to fantasize as long as you don't act on it. Jesus is saying, if you're spending a lot of time fantasizing, you are increasing the likelihood that you're going to act on it. How do you think adulterous liaisons start in the first place? They don't just happen, right? They get entertained and then they're acted upon. He's speaking to this final criterion of goodness, that not only should we fully know the good and fully do it and consistently act on that knowledge, but we need to fully desire the good. That's the transformation that Jesus promises, right? When we, through grace, in faith, right, act on his call to follow him, right, and his way. Does that make sense? If you've been watching The Chosen, that show, right, and how those guys just start following him, right? Yeah. They're answering possibly that sensus divinitas within them, right? Yeah. Give that some cultivation. This is the part of us that doesn't get cultivated much anymore, right? Because we're too busy binge watching Game of Thrones, right? There it is.
Yeah, a lot of interesting stuff tonight. I think what kind of hits out at me is, Dr. Carper and I talked a little bit about this, like at the dinner table before the Apologetics Club. But I thought I came to this point in 2016 where, am I a Christian because I want to believe the Bible is true, or because I truly believe it is the truth?
Yeah.
And so that was sort of the dilemma I was facing, and that we've talked about. This
And that's the level of conviction. That's why I put that word in there. That's what the knowledge of God should ultimately do to us. That's the deepest level. Convict, right? I'm a sinner. And because I'm a sinner, my mind is clouded as well. I know I don't find these arguments convincing enough, but I feel right. But I feel convicted, right? I feel like I am a convict. I belong in jail, but Lord, will you accept me? I give my life to you. See what I'm getting at here?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I came to the conclusion after, like, looking at certain types of evidence, and that's what apologetics is all about.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought to myself, well, not everything in the Bible actually appeals to me. And if I didn't know of God or the Bible itself, then perhaps I wouldn't think this was a big deal or that was a big deal,
Right.
which was another thing that was discussed last night. And I think sexual sin is one of the things that the culture in modern times doesn't really understand why it is a big deal. That kind of has been lost.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Yeah.
that's just a thought.
Do you remember my last trip here when we did? We talked about law and gospel and how to use apologetics for evangelization. Do you remember that talk a little bit? I know you were there. I remember you. I remember, and I'm only bringing it up again because tonight we mostly worked on the laws of logic and how that can clear away some of the intellectual debris that gets in the way of us receiving God. Okay? Then there are the natural laws. And if you don't know, I can't launch into that now, but natural law philosophy and theology talks about the natures of things, the telos of things, right? And when we rebel against natural law, we get into trouble too, just like when we rebel against the laws of logic, right? And think truth is relative and just go with the flow and all of that, right? Well, that's not going to lead us to truth, right? Violating natural law is not going to lead us to truth. Then there's the level of the moral law, how we ought to live our lives, the 10 Commandments, which we've all 10 of them we've violated, right? And once we realize, though, that we are subject to all of these kinds of laws, right? All God ordained, right? And it doesn't mean we have to get every little piece in its proper place. That's not how people, from what I've seen in life, people don't come to God because they've perfectly arranged everything in their life. Okay, now I'm ready for God. No, that's not how it works. We come to God because we're broken individuals, right? We're disintegrated in various ways, right? But nevertheless, that's what I think apologetics does. And tonight, I just am trying to show that at the very least, what we need is to have open hearts towards this kind of material, right? If we're going to call ourselves open individuals, then be open to this as well, right? And see how it speaks to you, right? Guys, I want to just thank you not only for coming and being incredibly attentive and starting this great dialogue, but actually enduring with me for 2 hours. If I had medals, I would give them out right now. But thank you. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this. Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah.
Oh, were you gonna say something?
Oh, I just had a question, but it's
Oh, I was just gonna say that just announcements. We're not meeting next week. We're meeting next week, and we won't have a speaker. It will just kind of be, I guess, more open discussion, kind of like the dinners that we have that I'm not usually at, but like just hanging out to end the semester. So that's next Thursday.
Oh, I was just gonna ask. This is just something. Maybe you mentioned it, and maybe I just missed it. But for intelligent design, like the way that the universal constants are so specific, and the way that everything seems to have its own purpose. Like the counter argument that I've heard a bunch of times is this universe exists because it just or like this universe can only exist because everything is in this perfect balance. Like nature, like evolution or nature wouldn't
Yeah.
have had it any other way.
Yeah.
Like how,
Yeah, it's the argument on the other side from from brute fact. It just so we start off with we already know God doesn't exist. We don't see it. We just don't see any evidence. And all of these uh, design coincidences are just that. And the reason why we see them is because the out of this multiverse, the universe that we live in now that came into being, right, is just one of the many possibilities that came into being, and the way it came into being was all of these things just fell into the right place. That's why it came into being the way it did. Notice that the way to make this argument work, you've got to posit infinitive. This actually kind of gets at an idea from a famous 19th century German atheist named Friedrich Nietzsche. You've probably at least heard of this guy. He entertained this possibility. He called it the eternal recurrence of the same. And the argument simply goes like this. Have you heard of this argument before? The eternal recurrence of the same. If the universe, the material universe, has been around for an infinitude, then, hey, guess what? Infinity is a really long time. That's a really long time. We very likely already had this conversation. It's happened before. In fact, maybe it's happened even an infinite number of times. I don't know about you, but does that view sound attractive to you? Doesn't sound it. And even Nietzsche worried that it drained away all the possible meaning from life, even in a world of atheism, right? And the only thing he would come up with was what he called the will to power. Notice the word power. Will to power. Just rage against the universe. Create your own meaning. And that's what we're seeing in our culture today. I don't see that leading to a better world. I see it leading to a very unattractive world.
Yeah, and if I could, you mentioned, yeah, so that.
Do you know about Nietzsche's idea of return?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
I didn't know about that. But going more directly, yeah, to the again with the fine tuning,
Mm-hmm.
all the incredible fine tuning parameters of the universe. That people will sometimes talk about what they call the weak anthropic principle, which is kind of like what Carolyn was alluding to.
Mm-hmm.
They call it the weak anthropic. It's basically saying, hey, we shouldn't be surprised because we can see it, we can observe it. Therefore, that's why we can see it and observe it is because we're here. But it really, I think it really is kind of an illusion. It kind of diverts attention from the real issue.
Yeah.
The real issue is not that we can observe the universe. The real issue is that it is. That the universe is actually amazingly fine-tuned and can support life. That's the real thing. And I think when they make that case, it's really diverting attention from it. They're just kind of assuming, of course there would be a universe that's highly tuned and functional. And the fact that we happen to see it is not a big deal.
Yeah, I should have said that. I guess I see Nietzsche's ideas applying here, though, to this weak anthropic principle in that, oh boy, my batteries are running low. I just see that the issue here is partly, right, that the universe has had an infinitude to get things right. It finally did. We're here, right? I see that as still not answer the explanatory question that Aquinas is after. And I guess you were kind of getting at this too, though. Why are we here?
Right, that's right. It's diverting from the real issue.
It's diverting from the real issue.
Is why is
I should
there
have
a universe Why and how is
Yeah.
there a universe?
But that's
like
what I
this?
guess that's what I was getting at by saying, is this really an attractive view?
Yeah.
Right? If an honest atheist like Nietzsche worried over this, that it drained meaning from life, if even he says that, because he was for most of his life in his philosophy, he was really big on this notion that's very popular now. So now you know where this idea is coming from, and that is create your own meaning, right? Create your own meaning, right? Well, as I got into a conversation with a student at Lindenwood years ago when I was doing a similar talk one night in the library. And he said, I just don't see why we were talking about happiness, actually. What is happiness? Can we be happy, etc.? And I said to him, though, so let's say I'm the best baseball player in the world. But I'm also, morally speaking, a total, you know what, right? What if I'm also really immoral? Is my life meaningful? And he came back and said, well, if he thinks it is, it's okay. But that's not what I'm asking, right? I already know that he thinks it's. Or if I'm the jerk baseball player, I already know. I already believe my life has meaning because that's what I believe, right? But and I started asking other students, would you say this person's life is meaningful? And almost every student, some of them hesitated, but something pushed them to shake their heads and go, no. Isn't that interesting? Best athlete in the world, greatest athlete, but still a failure in life, morally speaking, right? See the point?
It's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
I read one time, like I was looking at a video of Michael Phelps describing his face going through depression. I thought that was kind of interesting. Like,
Yeah.
this guy's the most successful swimmer of all time.
Right.
And that's just objectively speaking. And he himself even went through a depression phase, and I thought, well, that's quite interesting, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. I just think. See, I don't know how technical to get here now because it's. I want to start talking about this thing called universals. I want to start talking about this thing called the natures of things again. Human beings have a nature, okay, I would argue. And before we even get to talking about where it comes from or who gave it to us or what gave it to us, how did we get this nature? Most human beings would say that their life is would be a failure if they did not wind up in some sense being or becoming a good human being, right? A morally good human being. And a lot of us may have a pretty loose and easy way of thinking about what we mean by that, right? Many people do. It's very human to be objective with other people. You ever notice this? But subjective with ourselves, right? That's called hypocrisy. That's one of many ways we can define hypocrisy, right? We hold high standards up to others for truth telling, but it's okay for me to lie here though, because I really need to lie here because I need to get out of this situation. Right? Right? But this is a universal feature of human nature, is the moral domain, right? Of our lives, the normative, the ought. It's not, and this is my big problem with the way evolution is often argued. It tries to be such a total explanation of who we are, right? But how do you get the ought from that, right? And in fact, generally you don't. This is why you see many evolutionists and evolutionary psychologists make arguments like, okay, well, men have strong libidos. It's hard for them to be sexually faithful. Therefore, it's okay. I mean, if they're unfaithful, they're just living out their nature, But see, we've just taken out the ought, right? See the point here? Right? And I think a lot of projection is going on at that point. Right? We're projecting onto the map of truth what we want the truth to be, right? Instead of subjecting ourselves to a deeper examination of truth, rationally speaking, right? I mean, even, again, someone like Aristotle has a far deeper view of what it means to be human than just, you're an animal, go live like one, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, I always say the easiest person to fool is not other people; it's actually yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I mean, obviously, as you pointed out, it's intrinsic in our nature because we know ourselves better than we know other people. So our own perspectives is what's easy to kind of put as an idol, so to speak.
Yeah.
But like, nevertheless, sometimes we do have morals like built into us that
Mm-hmm.
go against our self-interest at times.
Right.
And so since you brought up evolution, I thought it was kind of interesting. Like I asked atheists, where does this baseline morality that seems to span cultures comes from? But they say it comes from evolution, and I thought to myself, now evolution seems to have nothing to do with morality, and in fact, you would think it would drive people away from it. So
Yeah.
it's all about survival of the fittest and
Yep.
going in your own benefit, as you talked about.
This is my big problem with evolution too, is it tends to be reductive. It's reductionist in how it tries to reduce all of morality to survival. But that's not what morality is about, right? Right? And so it becomes a very low standard, right? And that's not much of a motivator to go out of your way to do the right thing. I'm just trying, because much of the time, doing what's just does not seem like what's in our best interests, right?
Take some extra.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Very good.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
This was good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, good to see all of you. Yeah.
For Jeremy.
Happy Mark. I met you before.
Take care, Mark.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It was really nice to
Yeah, nice to meet you. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank
you
you.
so much.
Yeah,
This is
thank
a really fantastic.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good. Did you need more?
Oh,
Did you-
just
Okay, good.
pass on some friends.
Okay, good. Take care.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll take a clean copy.
Right, good to see all of you.
Okay,
Nice
good.
to meet you, Vicky.
Really
For the
nice
files.
question.
Yes.
See you,
Hi,
Carol.
Mark.
Yeah, see you.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you again
And
so
Joseph,
much
you
for
have
joining me.
fantastic,
Yeah,
That's
thank you.
challenging
really
questions.
late notice because
You're
I've
very,
just not been on top of scheduling.
just the way you think
That's all right.
through is very,
No, we put it together.
really cool.
I mean, this is kind of what I've been
Everything
working
you
on
say
for
really
a while
resonates with me. I really,
when I'm not too busy. Oh,
I appreciate it.
Okay.
is this
I think it's still going.
just go like just